Hello and welcome to The World This Week with me, Gavin Lee, assessing the biggest global events of the past 7 days and distilling them into 45 minutes with, as ever, a fantastic panel of distinguished journalists. In a week where Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz completely open for commercial trade, appearing to end its almost 7-week de facto blockade of critical shipping, while President Trump imposed a US blockade on Iranian ports to strangle its ability to trade, Trump has vowed to continue enforcing what effectively is a US siege until the moment a peace deal is complete. While in Lebanon, no bombs are to be dropped and no shots to be fired for 10 days, so the Israeli military sources say they won't pull back from the south of the country, where troops say they're setting up a security zone against the threat of the Iranian-backed Hezbollah. President Trump has told reporters he thinks both wars are close to an end. His Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said if not, American weapons are, quote, locked, loaded and ready to destroy Iran's energy installations when its deal runs out in 4 days' time. And President Trump says he's written to China, asking them to stay out of the war.
I had heard that China is giving weapons to, you're seeing it all over the place, to Iran, that China's giving weapons.
Did he say he's giving them?
Yeah, and I wrote him a letter asking him not to do that. And he wrote me a letter saying that essentially he's not doing that.
It's been a week where Donald Trump challenged our perceptions as he uploaded an AI portrait of himself, which he quickly deleted. The presidential equivalent of hot dogs or legs, the duck-rabbit illusion, say what you see. Well, many saw Trump as a Christ-like healer. He said he was dressed as a doctor, after intense criticism from MAGA Catholics and other conservative Christians coming in the hours after he'd released a torrent of criticism aimed at Pope Leo, calling him weak on crime, weak on nuclear. The Pope has been even more outspoken in his criticism of Trump's wars and treatment of immigrants.
The masters of war pretend not to know that it takes only a moment to destroy. Yet often, a lifetime is often not enough to rebuild. They turn a blind eye to the fact that billions of dollars are spent on killing, on devastation, yet the resources needed for healing, education and restoration are nowhere to be found.
And it's been a historic week in Hungary as thousands celebrated into the night on the banks of the Danube after a political victory against the odds. It was a landslide election win for the party of Peter Magyar, government insider turned anti-corruption campaigner, ending the era of Viktor Orbán. Orbán, Europe's longest-serving leader, quickly conceded defeat after 16 years in office, where, according to the European Parliament, he silenced critics in a, quote, hybrid regime of electoral autocracy. The next leader outlined his intention for sweeping change after being invited by the Hungarian president, Tamás Sulyok, to form a government, who in turn was told to resign by Magyar. He announced his plan to suspend the state-owned broadcaster too, while on the state-owned broadcaster. This is what he said.
Másfélet vártam erre pár mondatra.
Nem állt szándékomban ezt a vádat.
Köszönöm szépen. Szóval meg fogjuk teremteni a független, objektív, pártatlan média feltételeit. Tudjuk, hogy nincs tökéletes média, de ami itt folyt 2010 óta, ami után Goebbels vagy az észak-koreai diktátor is megnyalta volna a 10 ujját, hogy egy igaz szó nem hangzott el, az biztos, hogy nem folytathat.
Time to meet our panel tonight. Here in the studio with me, Vivian Waltz, Paris correspondent for Time magazine, writing for Time since 2003 from dozens of countries around the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and a great friend of the programme. It is brilliant to see you tonight, Viv. I want to ask you about something. The images released this week, very deliberate images worthy of Kensington Palace Instagram page itself. This is Jordan Bardella. Let's take a look. This is Paris Match magazine this week. Let's have a look. Sunglasses in hand, twin fashion, blue shirts, navy trousers, jumpers with his new love. Princess Maria Carolina Chantal Eduarda Beatriz Henara de Borbone delle Due Sicilia. That's Maria Carolina of Bourbon, 2 Sicilies. He has, quote, Viv, decided to stop hiding. He's very happy to go public with a Bourbon princess. And supporters say he's sick of the paparazzi. Critics say it's conveniently close to the French elections. What do you think?
I say I wish the couple all the best. I don't think it's anyone else's business. It's a little bit on brand that he would go for a princess, of course. He is the young far-right royal himself and appears to have like the keys to the kingdom at the moment in France. And I find these kinds of stories personally a little irksome, diverting, distracting. Why hide? He's he's a young guy. He should be out there having fun and falling in love and doing everything that young people do.
We know from previous Paris Match magazines, and it's been highlighted in the French media this week, you see other previous presidential couples. Are we potentially looking at a presidential power couple in the making here? Or is it at least the framing, the optics of it? Or am I being too cynical there?
I think maybe, well, one can never be too cynical. Yes, I'm sure there is a tiny bit of that goes into the calculation. I think I've said on this program before that I find it very difficult to wrap my head around President Bardella, particularly at this moment in time in history in the world. But you certainly are looking at a power couple. And if they're coming out this public, I suspect they really are a couple that probably has a future of some kind. If it's in the Élysée, I'm not too sure about that.
Viv, as always, it is great to have you on board tonight. Thank you for being here. Let's go from the studio to Grenoble. Let's introduce our next panellist. We have journalist, author, analyst Andrew Yarrow. Good evening to you, Andrew. It's great to see you.
Good evening, Gavin. It's a pleasure to see you again and be back on.
Well, Andrew is reporter for the New York Times for more than a decade, turned, well, from poacher to gamekeeper as a speechwriter for the US government in the late 90s. And after the Clinton years, Andrew turned to consulting, academia, and has written 6 books, including The History of Look magazine, titled Look, How a Highly Influential Magazine Helped Define Mid-20th Century America. Is it worth saying, Andrew, having you back with us, to explain to people, Look dominated in the pre-internet times, peaking in the 60s. Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, would have been a teenager. Sergey Brin, Larry Page, the founders of Google, weren't even born yet. And back then they had an estimated 35 million readers, which would now be 35 million likes. Does Look magazine, its style experience, does it exist in any form right now in 2026?
It really doesn't. I mean, there isn't the kind of media that today that's listened to or read or seen in any fashion by people across the political spectrum. I mean, Look drew people together. I like to say that, or quote what President Obama has often said, that America's lost the ability to have a common national conversation. And we certainly see that in the America of Donald Trump. But, you know, in that era of Look and Life magazine, of the 3 networks, when tens of millions of Americans got the same news, people could converse, could talk about the same facts, the same ideas, and that's really not the case today.
You're in Grenoble. You're currently in the middle of a fellowship, which sounds rather Tolkien-esque, at Grenoble University. You are examining, though, masculinism and right-wing politics. You're comparing France to the US. Tell us about that.
Well, I had written a book, 8 years ago, published 8 years ago, called Man Out, Men on the Sidelines of American Life, that looked at problems that many American men, certainly not all, certainly not a majority, but many American men both have and cause, you know, ranging in terms of problems they have, mental health problems, addiction problems, problems in higher ed, problems in the labor force, to problems that they cause with violence, misogyny, and increasingly a politics that's kind of angry. And we've seen that in the United States. When I wrote, Donald Trump had just been elected in 2016, had just taken office in early 2017. And if anything, that kind of anger, those kinds of problems have only gotten worse. And, you know, we've seen a lot more attention to what people call the manosphere, these dark corners of the internet where there's a lot of very ugly, misogynistic, anti-feminist, often anti-immigrant, you name it, rhetoric out there.
And it seems to be less in the dark and less in the corners at the moment. And Andrew, it's great to have you with us. You, as I say, journalist, US government speechwriter. It'd be fantastic to hear your thoughts as well tonight. Let's cross from Grenoble. Let's go to London and bring in our next guest. We're joined by the award-winning correspondent and broadcaster with a name to give a Bourbon princess a run for her money. Welcome back to the show, former Europe editor and anchor at CNN, now director at Freud's Group Communications, Nina de Roy dos Santos, which, by my reckoning, is Nina from the King of the Saints. Is that right? Good evening, Nina.
That's right. Good evening, Gavin. Yes, marriage gave me something of a promotion, it seems. Although having married a Portuguese man, you should see how many names he has. It would probably confound your graphics department, I'd have thought. But it's a real pleasure to be with you yet again to discuss another very, very busy week in the world of world affairs. There's never a dull moment.
And to which... let me ask you about what's going on your side of the channel. Keir Starmer's job as Prime Minister looks to be, what would you say, particularly vulnerable right now?
Well, we've got local elections coming up on May the 7th. That is, according to polls, going to be a rough ride for the main parties in general. You know, the UK is facing a fractured electoral landscape just as much as other parts of the world. But of course, our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, spent a lot of time actually engaged in international diplomacy, which is why at the end of this very week, he's found himself in Paris, where you all are trying to sort out one of the most intractable problems, which is, of course, 20% of the world's oil going through key maritime passages like the Strait of Hormuz. So like many a world leader, many leaders in the West are having to deal with their own political difficulties and also a very, very turbulent world as well, which makes things more expensive for their electorates and makes all of us a lot more worried about our future security.
There is much to discuss tonight, Nina. Great to have you with us as well. Let's head from London. Let's complete the lineup in Berlin, where we can welcome Wendelin von Bridow to the programme, senior Germany correspondent for The Economist, who's been covering the Hungarian elections, which we will get into detail, Wendelin, shortly. Good evening to you.
Good evening.
It is great to see you again. I'd like to talk about The Economist's front page this week. It's a brilliant front page, focusing on what's shaping our times to regulate or not regulate AI. That is the question. We see... the few that control it for now, and it's about how long they can control it for, with the all-powerful anthropic model called Mythos. As we can see here, we'll see in a moment, these are the godlike tech bros and a tiny humanoid watching on. Explain to us the issues, the problems around Mythos.
I think we are now at a stage where the laissez-faire approach to AI is no longer possible. So Mythos is very good it is so good at exploiting the software vulnerabilities of banks and of hospitals that it is scary even to Anthropic's bosses. So they haven't actually released that, as you can see. They haven't widely released it, only to a small circle of companies, just because even Anthropic's bosses themselves want to to tread very cautiously. I think it's also related to the fact that Americans in particular, but people all over the world, are increasingly concerned about AI. And in America, it's 1 in 7 of Americans who are worried about their jobs, worried about the impact of AI. And it's such uncharted waters that I think by now we are at the stage where some regulatory scrutiny is needed, and it's also demanded by people.
It's a fascinating piece. It is a great read. Great to have you on board with us as well, Wendelin. We shall begin with that. We'll start in Miami, 9:30 Sunday morning. President Trump at his golf course resort, back from a night watching the Ultimate Fighting Championship in the city alongside Dana White, Marco Rubio. He'd been kept updated on peace talks with Iran via his Veep, JD Vance, from the Serena Hotel in Pakistan. It was Trump's Truth Social post that cast light on the outcome and what came next. So there you have it, he starts. The meeting went well, most points were agreed to, but the only point that really mattered, capital letters, nuclear, was not effective immediately. The US Navy, the finest in the world, he said, will begin the process of blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. The US command in the Middle East, CENTCOM, clarified the blockade would be on vessels entering or departing Iranian ports, while those simply transiting would not be impeded. Piracy, claimed Iran, whose own regime was currently demanding so-called transit fees for safe passage to be paid in Chinese currency or cryptocurrency. Both sides trying to force the other into economic surrender, or cry uncle, in the words of President Trump, testing the spirit of the ceasefire. By this afternoon was the word uncle cried. Iran announced the strait was completely open to commercial ships as long as the ceasefire holds. No talk of a toll fee for now, but no clarity either. President Trump said that Iran agreed never to close the Strait of Hormuz again. The regime is working to remove all sea mines from the strait, but the US blockade on Iranian ports will remain until the end of the war. All the while, 6 weeks, 4 days into the reignited war between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, a 10-day truce underway. Nina, let's begin with this one ceasefire becoming two this week, two blockades seeming to become one for now. What does this tell us, do you think, about the US strategy to reach the deal, to suffocate Iran's ability to trade?
Well, as usual, it's all up for guesswork because obviously, as we know, the Trump administration is one of the hardest administrations that world leaders have ever had to deal with in Washington in terms of trying to guess what exactly the plan is. But if you look at it at the moment, it appears as though this is two sides engaged in a very, very tense dance of sequencing, each one trying to figure out who's going to step on the off-ramp first. What's up for grabs? Well, obviously, there's the fact that Iran has its demands. It wants to be able to get its hands on frozen assets. It wants some kind of control over the Strait of Hormuz, or at least hypothetically in the future for countries to recognize that Iran does have this important economic lever that it can pull in the future. And the United States also has its demands that up until recently Iran has said have been maximal. So the question is, at which point will we get more details about who exactly has been able to blink first? Now, what's really uncomfortable for the moment for the shipping industry is that although Iran says, according to its foreign minister, that the Strait of Hormuz is open, many of them say, well, we don't want to be the ones to send a ship through to risk it. It is just too risky at this point. And the United States, from its point, as you were saying before, in a typical Trumpian tweet, which is in full capital letters, are still saying that they stick to the blockade. So it's very, very unclear. And there's hundreds of millions of dollars riding on this moment.
And meanwhile, Viv, listening to Nina, the optimism, certainly from the Trump administration, the rhetoric, we've heard this before, though, but he's now saying again he believes the end is near. A senior Iranian official, as we're talking, saying this to Reuters, Iran is ready to assure the world about peaceful nature of its nuclear work if its demands are met. So there's still horse trading going on. It seems that they're shaping up for, Pakistan talks a second time?
Yes, no, of course. This is going to be a very long and messy series of talks. And as Nina says, there's always the possibility that the Iranians will turn the lever on again. I mean, let's just step back a couple of months. The Strait of Hormuz was totally open. No one was talking about charging tankers to go through it. To step back a little bit further, there was a nuclear deal in place, one that had taken years to negotiate and hundreds of experts in the room. Now he's trying to kind of ram through something in a very, very haphazard way. And I think the problem for Trump is that he has finally hit a problem that is totally out of his control. And it's a very unfamiliar feeling for him. In fact, for most US presidents, he does not control the situation. And although, he is trumpeting this as a grand victory, it was the Iranians, not the Americans, that announced that the Strait of Hormuz was open. And that effectively gave them the upper hand, because if they can announce it, they can also announce just as easily that it's closed again. And I have no doubt that we will get to that point anyway. I mean, Nina raises another point, which is these tankers are uninsurable going through the Strait of Hormuz. No one's going to pay insurance. So therefore, you're left thinking, well, okay, we're going to pay Iran $2 million to send the oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Are we going to pay the insurance company $2 million, probably better to pay the Iranians because then you know you're going to get through. And I'm sure every shipping company is making the same kind of calculation.
And Andrew, one of the calculations that President Trump referred to at the top of this programme, we heard him talking about China. And I wonder whether you look at this in a leverage point of view. There was some confusion at the start of this week, Sunday. Why is the US putting a second blockade in place? Apparent blockade, at the ports. It even wasn't clear from President Trump's Truth Social either at the time. But there are some, I spoke to a Vice Admiral earlier on the programme, who said that he believed there was some success that the Trump administration could claim from what was going on right now. What's your take?
Well, I think the blockade was intended to prevent shipping of oil to countries like China, and China's the major purchaser of Iranian oil. And, the fact that blockade is still on, and the fact that the Iranians, too, have dictated, what passage there will be through the Strait of Hormuz. It will not be the route that tankers have gone, for years and years through the strait. It will be close to the Iranian shore, as Vivian and Nina have suggested. This is really a victory for Iran. And again, rolling back the clock 7 weeks, there was free passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Oil was trading at about $58 a barrel. Sure, it came down today, but we're still up around $90 a barrel. And we don't know what's going to happen at the end of, as your correspondent said, which ceasefire ends, the Lebanon ceasefire or the Iran-US ceasefire, which will end on Tuesday. And Trump has hardly been a predictable president. Mm-hmm. So I think it's very hard to see what's coming ahead. And his correspondence with Xi Jinping, Trump postponed a meeting with Xi, is now planning again to meet with Xi Jinping. But, this whole episode with Iran, in many ways, kind of is a signal to the Chinese that, the laws of international diplomacy and war don't really matter. And, does this give the Chinese license to operate around Taiwan and to move on Taiwan? I don't think it's going to happen, but, it's a kind of signal that the rules that the world has really operated by, in not always perfectly, but are kind of out the window with Donald Trump.
Nina, listening to Andrew, you might not be surprised to hear this, but you referred to it right at the start, Nina. We talked about the British Prime Minister, the French President chairing here in Paris, all of those countries, more than 40 countries, either world leaders or delegates from government, trying to work out a post-military support plan for kind of the Strait of Hormuz. And yet, the old engines of Europe, France and Germany, reportedly at loggerheads. The French saying that you can't have a belligerent involved in maintaining security, so therefore the US should be ruled out any post-plan for the Strait. Germany saying it is fundamental. What are you making of that?
Well, I think it's reflective of the fact that France and Germany are also at loggerheads when it comes to how to shore up Europe's security at a time when the United States is retrenching from that part of the world as well. Because remember, the backdrop to all of this is also the United States changing its focus in where it wants to focus on in the Middle East, in Europe, and instead being more focused on China as a big strategic rival. One of the things I would point out is that in the future, the United States has done a lot over Donald Trump's last two administrations to try and curry as much favor as possible with Middle Eastern powers, countries like Saudi Arabia, other countries in the region as well. But after what we've seen where they have seen themselves facing a barrage of missiles coming from Iran, this war seemingly wrong-footing them at the last minute, even though they apparently privately urged the United States not to take this kind of action with Israel. Maybe they may start to build pipelines towards the other sea to get their oil and gas out. You can imagine that type of infrastructure planning may well be underfoot. And also, just to point out, the last thing I would say is that where did Saudi Arabia go to try and seek new forms of defense against these Iranian missiles? It was President Zelensky of Ukraine who paid them a visit to try and show them their technology there. So, as you were saying before, France and Germany disunited on how to deal with the problem of America's disengagement from the security of the world in these key hotspots, but other players as well coming into play.
And Viv, a region you know well, the Gulf, a prospect of oil that you've looked into before. Pipelines as being a plan B, that other countries within the GCC, they call them, starting to look at alternatives.
Oh, definitely. And by the way, I mean, Saudi Aramco has been shipping 7 million barrels a day out of the Red Sea port. So they were best positioned to pivot. But aside from oil, you also have all of these countries looking for other arms deals. And that's really a big blow to the U.S. I mean, the defense contractors in the U.S. are giant concerns. And more you see Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, they're signing these big arms deals with South Korea and various other places. So they are certainly beginning to diversify, seeing the U.S. as just not a particularly safe bet.
Wendelin, President Trump saying on Sunday allies had agreed to secure the strait, then saying that NATO was not there for him. Today we're also hearing that he says he's been approached by NATO in a post-support plan. He said once again, you weren't there for me. There are reports this week in the Wall Street Journal citing European officials quietly building a structure that would allow NATO to future-proof, Trump-proof the organisation if the US suddenly pulls out. Germany appears to be on board with it. What's your reading of it?
I think Europeans realize more and more that they cannot count on America anymore, in general and in particular as the leading member of NATO, and they are preparing basically for a world NATO without America. And, the whole shoring up European defenses is all part of that. But, there's always hope that one day, there will be a time post the Trump presidency and things might return to the way they were before. But I think that hope is fading the longer this sort of uncertain state of affairs is lasting.
Very good to hear. Let's move on for now. We will return, as we have done for the past few weeks, to Iran, to Lebanon as well. But let's move to relations this week between the President and the Pope, which took a notable turn for the worse in the past 7 days. Two Americans, baby boomers, born 9 years apart. The Pope is the younger one, if you were wondering. One, the political leader of 350 million Americans. The other, the spiritual leader of 1.4 billion Catholics. In the lead up to this week, Pope Leo had been making public statements during blessings and sermons directed at ending the war in Iran, saying things like God does not bless any conflict, stop the madness of war, and more recently, specifically, that President Trump's threat to wipe out a civilization were truly unacceptable. President Trump had largely bobbed and weaved questions about the Pope, saying he hadn't seen criticism. He was sure he was a lovely man. Until this week, Sunday, on Air Force One, heading back to the White House, official government sources say President Trump had been watching the golf coverage on the Masters on CBS. When it finished, 60 Minutes programme came on with an interview of 3 US cardinals echoing Pope Leo's criticism.
Is this a just war?
No. Under Catholic teaching, this is not a just war.
Irritated at points of venting in a so-called screed, a signature-long rant of his Truth Social aimed at Pope Leo followed. Weak on crime, terrible on foreign policy, weak on nuclear. If I wasn't in the White House, Leo wouldn't be in the Vatican. He said that he liked his brother Louis much more than he liked him because Louis is all MAGA, he said. Then President Trump shared this image where he looks like Christ or a doctor, which he deletes because of the confusion. The Pope, who's now in Africa on a pastoral visit, has spoken since of tyrants who spend billions on war and manipulate religion and the very name of God for their own military, economic and military gain. Andrew, how do you assess the power of the Pope in his message, his diplomacy and the leverage he might hold on Trump's Catholic base?
Well, it's pretty foolish to attack the Pope, to attack not only the leader of 1.4 billion Catholics worldwide, but a quarter of the American population is Catholic or of Catholic background. And, we've seen a lot of conservative Catholics and Protestants in the United States react to President Trump's attacks on the Pope, the posting of the Jesus image, the truly bizarre image that he put up and took down that you quickly showed. But, it's strange. I think back to Pope Francis not that long ago, and, Pope Francis was, quite an outspoken figure for social justice in the world. And when Leo became Pope, when an American became Pope, people thought he would be more cautious. And here he's been thrust really by Trump's Iran war into a position of taking not only the position of the leader of the spiritual leader of Catholicism or of Christians, but really of any ethical human being, that, you don't talk about wiping out a civilization and you don't use religion as a justification for war. So it's hard to see how it can help Donald Trump.
Well, notably and interestingly, Viv, the biggest criticism of President Trump's Truth Social was not his criticism of Pope Leo, but from his base was the AI image of the Christ-like likeness.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot in this image which is really bizarre. The kind of military iconography, the, Statue of Liberty. But aside from that, it's the hour of the night when all of this was posted. He was up all night long posting, ranting. And so it raised a lot of issues, legitimate issues, about his state of mind, his cognitive health or lack thereof. You have mounting calls in Congress for a real independent cognitive examination of the most powerful person in the world, who's about to turn 80, by the way, in a couple of months. So there are really, aside from the kind of bizarreness of this all, they're very serious questions around this. And, as Andrew says, you have 55% of Catholics voted for Donald Trump. He was way ahead in the Catholic vote, ahead of Kamala Harris, particularly among Latinos, who are by and large 100% Catholic in the US. And they provided an absolutely crucial swing vote for Trump. I don't think this is going to be forgotten, actually. We're 7 months away from the elections, from the midterm elections. And I think particularly given the fact that this was such a striking image, I think it's going to live on.
Wendelin, there's a notable friend of President Trump in Europe to a degree, although his rhetoric on her has changed recently, saying that she's not the same as she was before. Giorgia Meloni, she chose the Pope over the President, saying the words of the President were unacceptable. The Pope is the head of the Catholic Church. It's right, it's normal, she said, for him to call for peace. Other European leaders this week appear to be keeping their heads down on this one. The art of playing the grey man, maybe, lest it should be haunting them for doing so. What do you make of that?
Well, Donald Trump is really running out of friends in Europe. He had a few to start with, and Giorgia Meloni was one. She was, even the Trump whisperer for many, and now they have sort of fallen out. And of course, most of all, he has lost Viktor Orban, who was voted out of office, who was probably his staunchest ally in Europe. So in so many ways, these have been bad weeks for Trump. But in Europe, they've been really bad weeks because he's losing his friends. The NATO alliance is falling apart, partly due to him or mainly due to him. And I don't see how this damage can be repaired anytime soon, indeed.
Let's look at another thing related. Nina, I'd like your take on this. This was something quite extraordinary this week. Interesting coming in the week of the Pope's conversation. But this is Peter Hegseth giving a Christian worship on Wednesday, asking for a moment of prayer and reading out almost word for word the Quentin Tarantino script from Pulp Fiction. Let's take a look.
And I will strike down upon thee with great vengeance and furious anger.
Great vengeance and furious anger.
Those who attempt to capture and destroy my brother.
Those who attempt to poison and destroy my brother.
And you will know my call sign.
And you will know my name
is Sandy One.
Is the Lord.
When I lay my vengeance.
When I lay my vengeance upon thee.
And amen.
So this week began with Doctor or Christ, Nina. Now we have Tarantino, or a Hollywood version of Ezekiel 27:17, which is the part of the Bible that this famous movie scene was taken from and adapted. Peter Hegseth said it was used for the rescue crew for the search and rescue mission in Iran. What do you make of it? Did he not know it was Tarantino, or do you think maybe it was an inside joke?
We don't really know, but yet again, obviously, as Vivian was just saying before, we're in an era where popular culture and political culture appear to be merging. And some of these figures, like the United States President, the Secretary for the Department of War, Pete Hegseth, are in charge of enormous briefs and making enormous decisions that do have real life or death implications. And I think that's where the juxtaposition between this focus on the Pope, or using religious iconography, or using passages from the Bible, makes a lot of voters in the United States very, very uncomfortable, particularly on the right of the political spectrum. As you just mentioned before, Andrew and Vivian both mentioned the importance of the Catholic part of the electorate in the United States and their support for Donald Trump, particularly in his return to office in 2024. But also remember that there's the evangelical base to consider as well, who may well, in some cases, immediately recognize that particular passage. Maybe that's why Pete Hegseth decided to use it. But also, many of those people will also seen that film as well and may be left a little bit befuddled, or sometimes, in some cases, revulsed that that was the passage that was used. Because as your editors put the footage together, you could clearly see that it was used in a much more pugnacious content in Quentin Tarantino's film.
Yeah, maybe we won't get to the bottom of that from the Pentagon. And given that the reporting from the Pentagon is much harder than it used to be as well. Let's move from events there. Let's head to the oldest part of Budapest, up on Castle Hill, Wednesday mid-morning, where the new Prime Minister-in-waiting, Peter Magyar, was on the balcony of the presidential palace, given a tour by the country's president, Tamás Salyok. We'll get to him in a moment. Not the transitional imagery that we're used to, but what happened next is not AI generated. Peter Magyar spotted the outgoing Prime Minister Viktor Orbán on the balcony. Is that him reading, he says.
Abszolút filmszínház.
Absolute cinema is how Peter Magyar described it, asking his followers on Facebook whether Mr. Orbán was reading his farewell speech, B, a newspaper, or C, the latest statement from President Trump. Social media has been fundamental to Peter Magyar's election success. He won by a landslide, a supermajority, enough to be able to make changes to a system known to have long reinforced the power of the populist government for the last 16 years. Still weeks away from taking office, the Prime Minister-elect gave a 3-hour press conference at the start of the week, pledging to pursue those who, quote, plundered, looted, betrayed, indebted, ruined his country, promising a new era. And he claimed the outgoing Foreign Secretary, who's alleged to have had questionably close links to Russia, had locked himself away and was destroying papers.
They are currently destroying documents that have to do with the sanctions. This is what's happening in Hungary. We know that people have been destroying documents, just like in the old communist age.
Well, Peter Szijjártó, the Foreign Minister outgoing, strongly denies those allegations. Back to the president on the balcony, Tamas Salyuk, who's widely seen as closely aligned with Viktor Orban's system. He's unworthy of representing national unity, said Peter Magyar, who told the president there and then to his face he wants him to resign. Wendelin, you've been following this closely. We've been reading your material in The Economist. A new broom is certainly sweeping clean. This is a drama playing out on a whole other level in Hungary right now.
Absolutely. I mean, what's happened is amazing. And one thing which actually really surprised me, having been twice to Hungary in recent months, is how actually Viktor Orban was very graceful in his concession. He conceded quickly, and he conceded for his standards almost gracefully. So that is good news. And of course, a 2/3 majority for TISA, for Peter Magyar's party, is also very good news, because he needs that for real change. And real change is needed. I mean, Fidesz, so the party of Mr. Orban, is everywhere, in all the state's institutions, the media, all dominated by Fidesz. So Peter Magyar has already asked the head of the Constitutional Court, the head of the Supreme Court, and the public prosecutor to resign. And if they don't go, he will try to use his 2/3 majority to make them go. But this is only a start. So he has to basically reverse state capture by Fidesz. 16 years of Orban rule cannot be undone in a few months. I mean, this will take a while, but Peter Magyar has the tools to do that, because the voters have handed him such an overwhelming victory, even though the whole system was completely skewed in favor of Fidesz, with gerrymandering and other mechanisms. Viktor Orban had managed to basically reshape the entire system to his advantage. So, the jury's still out. Peter Magyar now has an incredibly tough job at his hands, and his first priority will be, apart from all the domestic issues, to repair relations with the European Union, to go to Brussels, and of course to unblock the 17 or 18 billion euros that have been withheld from Hungary, and that's equivalent to about 10% of GDP. So this is a lot of money for a small, relatively poor country. So, you can see he has a big job at his hands. Sorry.
We saw at the start of the programme this kind of jaw-dropping interview that he gave on the state-owned public broadcaster, where he was talking about the propagandists of North Korea will be licking their lips of what you've been doing, and said, I'm not taking this personally, but you're being suspended, and we'll look again at making this independent. In terms of journalism, what is he pledging to do there?
Well, he wants to basically, state media, and actually nearly all media have been controlled or are controlled by Fidesz. So he basically says, you public broadcaster, you will stop broadcasting until, I can assure there is impartial broadcasting. So he is trying to do this very quickly, because even though, there are social media and there were still some independent media like 444.hu and a few others, but the vast majority, and certainly the state broadcaster, has been completely in Fidesz hands.
Let's get the take of Viv and Nina. First of all, Viv, just trying to work out now kind of Viktor Orban's position, which was mentioned a moment ago, this end of an era. He said this in his interview. He gave an interview as well. Peter Magyar called it decapturing the state. Viktor Orban said, he was asked, was it corruption? Was it his luxury lifestyle of his elite circle that caused the results? He denied corruption, but he said, quote, luxury is another matter, and it did affect the result.
Oh, for sure. I mean, if you travel around Hungary, and I haven't been there since last summer, but if you travel around, including to like the stronghold of Fidesz, it is quite incredible, the sort of gap between the way regular Hungarians are now living and the kind of Fidesz party, hierarchy. It was very, very obvious to everybody, particularly out in the countryside, where you had, these vast kind of estates and plots of lands and so on. But what's also really important is that Orban has blocked for years the EU aid package to Ukraine, which I believe is something like 90 billion euros. And he's effectively been the roadblock for a lot of things within the EU. So even now that he's gone, it seems to me like the EU is really going to have to rethink the way that they take these crucial decisions, because there surely will be another Orban sooner or later, and then they're back to the situation that they were in before.
And Nina, we've got a minute to go, but I would like your thought on this. Other European leaders, Moscow, Washington, are having to recalibrate relationships right now.
Well, they'll definitely have to recalibrate relationships with Hungary because, as your previous guests have just said, mending relations with the EU is crucial for this country of 9 million. And Peter Magyar's made that very, very clear. One thing that's interesting is that among his 3 priorities, aside from mending Brussels relationships and tackling corruption, he wants to limit the number of terms that a prime minister can serve for. And that is to assuage fears that he himself, having previously been allied to Orban, having previously been married to a justice minister under Fidesz's party, that he would become another Orban. Having said that, though, as the EU is losing one far-right leader, remember that there are elections coming up in other key parts of the EU that are even bigger, like France in a year's time. And, there are other parties from the right that are in the ascendant, not in the descendant across the EU.
Nina, thank you. The journalist and broadcaster Nina dos Santos, now director at Freud's Communications. Thank you so much tonight, Nina. And to all of you, it was a programme, fantastic on-the-ground experience. I always say it, that AI cannot replicate. Thank you to Viv Walt, Paris correspondent for Time magazine and Fortune magazine as well. Grenoble, thank you to journalist, academic, author Andrew Yarrow. Thank you to you, Andrew. And in Berlin, Wendelin von Bredow, The Economist senior correspondent in Germany. Thank you to Wendelin. Well, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to the podcast. We will wrap up this week with a quote from a recent article for Semaphore by the media editor Max Tarney, who was writing about the pros and the cons and the temptations of cold calling President Trump on his mobile, who does apparently answer sometimes at all hours. Max quotes a colleague who said, "I'm like Frodo with a ring. I know it's dangerous, but he keeps beckoning me." It's a timely quote. This week, Warner Brothers announcing the latest cast for the new Lord of the Rings installment, The Hunt for Gollum. Jamie Dornan, Kate Winslet, Leo Wood are all signed up, and Andy Serkis will be reprising his role of Smeagol. So in a world where breaking news is often drip-fed one Truth Social after another, we will leave you with Andy Serkis's memorable reading of some of the president's tweets as Gollum on The Late Show. Stay precious. We will see you in 7 daisies for the world next week.
The fake news media has never been so wrong or so dirty. Purposely incorrect stories and phony sources to meet their agenda of hate. Sad.